Thanks for joining me again. Today we're taking a last look at this first main section of Isaiah, which runs from 2:1 to 4 verse 6. We've seen how God is visiting his displeasure on his people so that he can make them into the beautiful bride that he wants them to be. That's the purpose behind everything he's doing. In the first part of chapter 3, 1 to 15, God is taking away godly leadership from his people. And then in 3:16 to 4:1, God takes away something else before, in 4:2 to 6, finally restoring and beautifying his people. So in 3:16 to 4:1, God takes away something else. Last time it was leadership. This time, let's call it luxuries. And here, God has the women of Judah in his sight. They're probably the wives of the leaders, but not exclusively. And their finery and the outward display of self-sufficiency parallels, I think, with the swagger and the arrogance of the male leaders. The desperate plea of 4 verse 1. And 7 women shall take hold of one man in that day, saying, we will eat our own bread and wear our own clothes. Only let us be called by your name. Take away our reproach. That verse, I think, parallels the plea of chapter 3, verse 6. For a man will take hold of his brother in the house of his father, saying, you have a cloak, you shall be our leader, and this heap of ruins shall be under your rule. So God's people, and the women in particular, were glorying in their material possessions and in their luxuries. But everything is going to be very different for these women when the judgment of God comes to the land. In that day, verse 18 begins, nobody would notice their expensive clothes, their jewelry, their perfumes, their elaborate coiffures. In contrast with their pride and their wealth and their beauty, the women of Zion would be in deep distress. Look at verses 17 to 4:1. They would have sores on their heads and they'd be bald. Now, this baldness may refer to their shaving their heads either in mourning or for medical reasons, but because of their head sores. Being in deep distress, they would not care how they looked. In fact, the Lord would cause the Babylonian soldiers to take away all the women's fine jewelry and wardrobes, verses 19 to 23. Instead of fragrance, they would have an awful smell, verse 24, perhaps from their head sores that we mentioned a moment ago. And taken captive by the Babylonians, the women would be pulled by a rope and would wear sackcloth, black coarse cloth made from goat's hair, and symbolizing mourning and grieving. Their beauty would be replaced by painful branding by their captors. The women would mourn because their men, their husbands, their brothers, their male friends would be dying in battle, verse 25. The city would be so destitute of men, and the women would be so disgraced that they would compete to gain a husband, as we read in verse 1 of chapter 4. Years later, Jeremiah wrote that the women in this situation actually resorted to eating their own children during the siege. Now, all of this is symbolic and is representative of a people who glory in their material luxuries, perhaps believing that they are evidence of God's favor and approval. And God strips them all away. And note that all of this happens, quote, in that day, the day of reckoning, chapter 3, verse 6, verse 18, chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, of which, as we've seen, there will be many precursors to the final one. And all of these are effects of invasion, captivity, and exile. The leaders are all taken away, as we've seen. There's desperate poverty. And there's not enough men to go round as husbands for the community. The question God is asking his people throughout this whole opening section of Isaiah's prophecy is simply this: who do you trust? Where is your confidence? Perhaps you feel a bit like that run-down cottage we talked about last time. And if we will not empty and humble ourselves, then God will do it for us. and it will not be pleasant. But God wants and will make his people fit for purpose. But his process is almost certainly not one we would have chosen for ourselves. Listen to this prayer of John Newton. I ask the Lord that I might grow in faith and love and every grace, might more of his salvation know, and seek more earnestly his face. 'Twas he who taught me thus to pray, and he, I trust, has answered prayer. But it has been in such a way as almost drove me to despair. I hope that in some favoured hour at once he'd answer my requests, and by his love's constraining power subdue my sins and give me rest. Instead of this, he made me feel the hidden evils of my heart, and let the angry powers of hell assault my soul in every part. Yea, more, with his own hand, he seemed intent to aggravate my woe, crossed all the fair designs I schemed, blasted my gourds, and laid me low. Lord, why is this? I trembling cried. Wilt thou pursue thy worm to death? 'Tis in this way, the Lord replied, I answer prayer for grace and faith. These inward trials I employ from self and pride to set thee free and break thy schemes of earthly joy, that thou mayest find thy all in me. And then as this section concludes in Isaiah 4, 2-6, we have a glorious contrast and a beautiful scenario of God's people in the future. There's a reference to the branch of the Lord and the fruit of the land. There's a messianic title for Jesus. We know it from 11:1, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. It's also used by Jeremiah and Zechariah elsewhere in the Old Testament. And here's the result of all the stripping away and the emptying that God is doing among his own special people. The people of God are given new life and new beauty by the person and work of the promised Messiah, who is, of course, God's own Son. And they will be purified through the refining fire of judgment and will in the future enjoy the glorious presence of the glory of God, which they had previously assiduously despised. Friends, this restoration work was partially fulfilled in the return of Israel from exile. It was partially fulfilled by the coming of Christ and the birth of the church. You remember that Paul describes the church as a holy temple in the Lord, a dwelling place for God by the Spirit. Remember that rundown old cottage now? And this work will be fully fulfilled at the return of Christ. Now, why do all this? Why does God go to all these lengths? And the answer is simple: to bring into being a bride fit for the king.